for certain is that my dad was a very blessed man. And John, you need to know for the last 7 months, visited with my dad every day. And there's another angel in the room that my dad was particularly blessed to have in his life. And that's Carla, who was his personal aide for the last 2.5 years. And if I could be so fortunate when it's my time that such an angel arrives for me. My father's dad was an orphan, and he spent time with his foster family, who, the name of the family was the Riches, and they lived in a small town in the Berkshires, Chester, Massachusetts. He was raised up on a small farm. And when my dad was a boy, his dad would take him back to the farm in Chester, and they'd trot through the woods and hunt. And when they got through with their day, they were invited into the home. However, at this point in time, that home no longer belonged to my grandfather's foster parents. It had been sold to another family, but the family was kind enough to invite my dad and his dad into their home. So fast forward now, say 15, 16 years. My dad's at college. He was particularly proud of a Ford Roadster that he had, and he was driving through the campus and turned the corner, and by happenstance, knocked a young lady off her bicycle. And that's how my dad met my mom. After a brief courtship, my mom thought it would be appropriate to invite my dad to her home to meet her parents. So he obliged, and off they went. And my mom's home was a little farm in Chester, Massachusetts, in the Berkshires. And what makes this a particularly interesting story is that my mom was born in England, and when she was 6 years old, she came to this country, and her parents purchased this farm from my grandfather's foster parents. And that was the beginning of a relationship between my mom and dad that lasted for 51 years. And after my mom passed, my dad remarried. He married Carolyn Hayes. And John Hayes was a college friend of both my mom and dad, and John and Carolyn were a couple friends of my folks for many years. And after Carolyn passed away, my dad connected with Sweet Kay, a partner and companion and dear, dear friend, right to the last day of my father's life. So my dad, 91 years and 3 significant relationships, at least the ones I was privy to. Very different women in many respects. But my dad treated each of them exactly the same. He was loyal, he was committed, he was caring, he was loving, and he was particularly sentimental. He was a bit of a romantic. So, who was Fred? Who was my dad? I've met many people in the last couple of years that knew my dad from the community, from his professional life. And they always pulled me aside and had particularly kind things to say about my dad. And most recently, in the last week or so, I had the chance to speak to a woman who was responsible for managing my father's portfolio, and she said, Mel, she said, your dad was such a sweet man. And I hung up the phone and I felt into that, and he was a very, very sweet, sweet man. So how do I remember my dad? For me, my dad was a stoic. He was a real character out of the book, The Greatest Generation. And like many of the World War II guys, he had a sense of duty and service, commitment, loyalty, and as John pointed out, he did it in such an unassuming way. I remember my dad as a particularly disciplined man. He loved structure. In fact, for me, he was kind of like a metronome. And by example, as a young boy, I remember in particular one of his religious routines. He had a way of getting up and arising every morning that he never altered. And it was incredibly structured and ritualistic. And so this is how I remember it. Now, to set the setting, we lived in a small ranch. My parents' bedroom was over here. I had a bedroom here. I looked out into a hallway. And my father got up every morning at the exact same time, 6:45. Not 6:46, 6:45. And he got awakened by an alarm clock radio that had always been precept to, some of the folks here will know this, Bob Steele. And more often than not, between 6:45 and 7 o'clock in the morning, Bob Steele was wishing somebody who was at least over 80 years old a happy birthday that day. So that's how he initially got up to. Happy birthday to Betty, who turned 90 today, from East Hartford. And then he would walk down the hall, and the first thing he would do is outside my door in the hallway was the thermostat. Of course, the temperature had been turned down for the evening, and now it was going to be adjusted up for the rest of the day. And then after that, we walked down the hall and into the kitchen, and he let our dog Cindy out for the morning walk, brought her back in, fed her, showered and shaved, got ready for his day. And it never altered. For instance, he never fed Cindy and then fixed the thermostat. My dad was a planful sort of guy and depended on having marker events always laid out in front of him that he could shoot for. What was coming up next? What festive event? He loved to be around family and friends, and he loved festivity. He loved holidays. And he looked forward to them. When people gathered, he just thrived in that energy, and he wasn't the center of the energy. He wasn't the one spinning the yarn, telling the joke, but he was the one on the sidelines laughing at the joke and just bathing in the wonderful energy of that kind of communion. And it really lit him up. My dad didn't have a particularly rich, emotive vocabulary. He was a pretty practical man, and in his language, in talking with him, one almost had to interview him to have a conversation. But as my dad got older, he could not hold back his feelings. And what he couldn't say in words, he said with welled up tears and a quivering lip when he saw you, or he remembered something, or he shared a story about somebody who had come